Until the 1990s, animation occupied a fairly marginal presence in Hollywood. Today, it's at the heart of the industry and of contemporary popular culture. This transformation did not occur overnight. It reflects a number of major shifts in industry and also in style. The most visible difference is the reinvention of a mostly cell animated medium to one that's almost entirely computer animated. However, we've also seen the emergence of several rivals to Disney's traditional preeminence in the animation marketplace, leading to a huge surge in production and the year-round proliferation of major animated features. A broadening of the aesthetic and narrative horizons of Hollywood animation to encompass new genres and stylistic approaches, the continued rise of multimedia family entertainment franchises built around tentpole animated features, and finally, an ongoing blurring of boundaries between animation and live action. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss the rise of animation in Hollywood since the 1990s, drawing on arguments that I've made in my recent book, Contemporary Hollywood Animation, which was published earlier this year by Edinburgh University Press. I'm going to talk about developments in industry and style, identify narrative and thematic patterns, and explore how animation responds to and also projects the values, beliefs, hopes, and fears of the nation. As animation scholar Paul Wells argues, mainstream animation in the United States has the capacity to offer insights into society, aligning with and depicting the most human of needs, desires, thoughts, and feelings. Equally, it reaches out towards an all-inclusive mass audience through narrative strategies and humanistic values that resonate with international audiences of all ages and backgrounds. So in this talk, I do four things. Firstly, I'll make a brief survey of production trends in Hollywood feature animation from the 1930s to the present. Second, I'll present an overview of the major changes in the Hollywood film industry since the 1970s, contextualizing the resurgence of animation within developments in live-action cinema and in family entertainment. Third, I'll examine the stylistic continuities and changes in post-1990s Hollywood animation, particularly with the rise of computer animation. And fourth and last, I'll weigh the recurrent narrative strategies and mythological influences on the form against more recent changes in storytelling conventions. So firstly, and very basically, I argue that we can divide the production history of feature animation in the United States into two very broad eras. A classical one, 1937 to 1989, in which relatively few films were made and Disney was almost entirely dominant. And then a post-classical or contemporary era from 1990 to the present, which is characterized by a much greater diversity in genre and style, a huge surge in production, and the ever-increasing centrality of animation within the film industry. Altogether, more than 75% of all major animated feature films released theatrically in the United States have been made after 1990. So we can gauge the extent to which animation really is a contemporary phenomenon rather than a classical phenomenon. So how did animation attain its current centrality within Hollywood? There were several turning points. Firstly, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg produced or directed a number of phenomenally successful live-action family films, including Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., and Indiana Jones. These films and franchises mobilized the traditional family audience that Disney had catered to since the 1930s, but they also succeeded in attracting teenagers and adults as well. Disney executives began to realize that the company was being left behind by its rivals, partly because Disney films had attained the association of being only for children rather than being for all-inclusive family audiences. And its animated films were being viewed as increasingly old-fashioned and lacking the hip edge that made the Lucas Spielberg blockbusters stand out. In 1984, a new corporate team assumed office at Disney, headed by Michael Eisner, who had previously been president of Paramount Pictures, and also backed by Roy E. Disney, Walt Disney's nephew. Alongside executives Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg, Eisner oversaw Disney's gradual re-emergence from its prolonged malaise in the 1970s and early 80s, which had seen it being increasingly a peripheral presence within the Hollywood film industry. Katzenberg in particular was convinced that animation was a unique Disney asset and invested in a new program of animated features intended to lure the teenage and adult demographics back to the studio. It seems extraordinary looking back, but in the mid to late 1980s, there was a serious risk that Disney's animation division would be shut down entirely because it was seen as being so old-fashioned and out of step with current trends within the film industry. So it was Jeffrey Katzenberg and Roy E. Disney who petitioned to save the animation section, and that ended up turning Disney around. So the first breakthrough film was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a live-action animated hybrid co-produced by Steven Spielberg's Amblin and released under Disney's adult banner, Touchstone. The second was Disney's animated fairy tale adaptation, The Little Mermaid. But Disney was concerned that both films would appeal mostly to children, so they arranged rigorous audience testing with adult audiences. And encouraged by the positive feedback, Disney ensured that the film's marketing strategies emphasized their appeal to older viewers as well as to children. And both films made hundreds of millions of dollars at the global box office, paving the way for the so-called Disney Renaissance of the 1990s. While Disney Renaissance films such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and The Lion King established the basic narrative patterns of contemporary Hollywood animation, the industrial resurgence of animation owes more to Pixar's Toy Story and developments in CGI, computer-generated imagery. Toy Story's popularity upon its release in 1995 proved that audiences were enthusiastic about the possibilities of computer animation. The barriers to entry were also much lower than for hand-drawn animation because films could be made at a much faster rate. As a result of this, during the late 1990s and 2000s, production of theatrically released animated features expanded greatly. Most of them were computer-animated films, a medium that was described by Variety in 2008 as Hollywood's most reliable and lucrative genre. Disney's monopoly in the field was disrupted by the emergence of Pixar and by the formation of DreamWorks in 1994. The monopoly was broken altogether by the appearance of other studios such as Blue Sky, Illumination, and Laika, and the new animation divisions of established major studios like Sony and Warner Brothers. It's very notable that since 1998, there's actually only been 1 year, 2014, in which at least one animated feature hasn't made the global top 10 highest grossing films of the year. So since the late 1990s, animated features have been global blockbusters that have dominated the upper reaches of the box office charts. Another feature of post-1990s Hollywood animation is the studio's dependence on hit sequels to hit films. With the exception of Disney and Pixar, which still produce a fairly diverse roster of films, partly to supply new diversified content for their theme parks and also ancillary revenue streams, almost all of the major players in the feature animation market are heavily reliant on one or two tentpole franchises. DreamWorks with Shrek and Madagascar, Illumination with Despicable Me and Minions, Blue Sky with Ice Age, and Sony with Hotel Transylvania. So for studios that lack the established brand identity of Disney or Pixar, long-running film series have become a commercial necessity. Paramount and Leica, the least profitable Hollywood major studios in terms of animation, do not possess any such franchises. And that's one of the big reasons why they don't have a level of popularity on the same level as those of the other studios that I've just mentioned. Box office figures certainly prove the centrality of family-orientated animation in contemporary Hollywood, but it's very important to emphasize that films are never self-contained entities. They always form part of larger multimedia and transmedia franchises, and they fit very much within Hollywood's broader embrace of family entertainment since the 1970s. Family entertainment franchises, both live action and animation, are central to the operations of the horizontally integrated international multimedia conglomerates that produce Hollywood films. These companies need to realize their products across multiple platforms, including films, television, publishing, games, comic books, toys, clothing, and other kinds of merchandise. And franchises of this kind present the best opportunities to access a broad, all-age international market, not just through the films, but through these other products as well. So consequently, not only must animated films be accessible and appealing to mass audiences, but the brand images at their core must also be accessible and exploitable across a number of media outlets. So one example of that would be the Despicable Me franchise and the Minions characters, which have become suffused in popular culture, in a sense, since the emergence of the original film. And of course, one of the biggest lessons Hollywood learned from the success of the Star Wars multimedia franchise is the importance of synergy. Roughly speaking, synergy refers to the ability to exploit a given product across numerous platforms within the same multimedia conglomerate. This informed Disney's acquisitions of Pixar Animation in 2006, Lucasfilm in 2012, and 21st Century Fox in 2019. In the aftermath of the Pixar deal, Disney executive Dick Cook said, "You can't come close to calculating what this acquisition means in the long term for the company in terms of new characters, stories, and lands for films and parks and publishing, and more." Disney's chief executive officer, Bob Iger, made similar remarks after the Lucasfilm acquisition, which he described as one of the greatest family entertainment franchises of all time, which would give us a great footprint in consumer products globally. So again, we can see from these kind of comments that the motivation for these acquisitions are in terms of the universe of the films rather than the films themselves. So in turn, this points to a broad commercial reality in contemporary Hollywood family entertainment. Films are just constituent elements in larger multimedia franchises set within the same fictional universe, including television and theatrical spin-offs, books, video games, theme park rides, toys, and lots of other kinds of ancillary revenue streams. For studios with theme parks, the relationship between brands and creative content becomes especially important. One of the most famous examples of multimedia synergy is Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean series, which is adapted from nothing more than a theme park ride. As Siobhan O'Flynn points out, we might think of Disney's theme parks as ancillary to the films, but the truth is in fact the reverse of that. Based on revenue reports in 2017 fiscal year, the revenue from the parks and resorts earned more than double the revenue from all studio entertainment at $18.42 billion versus $8.38 billion respectively, which includes the production and acquisition of live action and animated motion pictures, direct-to-video content, musical recordings, including a substantial roster of artists and live shows, and live stage plays. So the Disney theme parks and hotels are a much more profitable revenue stream for Disney than their creative content. So all of this underlines the fact that in corporate as well as industrial terms, there is now much less differentiation between live action and animated films than there ever was in the Hollywood classical era. The seemingly terminal decline of the mid-budget, adult-orientated live-action film has encouraged the major studios to pursue a creative, conservative strategy of making big-budget, tentpole films built around accessible brands that can be exploited across multiple media platforms. This policy reflects declining revenues across the board in Hollywood in recent years, not helped by the decline of the DVD market in 2009. As film journalist Ben Fritz points out, in the franchise age of filmmaking, perhaps only one thing about movies remains unique. They're home to the biggest, most globally popular brands. The decreasing importance of the North American film market, which now comprises only about 30% of the global box office, has also accelerated Hollywood's reliance on family entertainment, including the kinds of animated films and franchises that are now at the forefront of the film industry. There are several reasons for this, and they include the more conservative censorship regulations in many territories, which therefore tend to prioritize child and family-suitable films over adult-orientated ones. There's also the tendency for non-American cinema goers to attend fewer films, leading to a privileging of event movies, blockbusters in other words. And the fact that, as Disney executive Mark Zoradi notes, the fantasy genre, which is closely aligned with children's and family films, travels exceptionally well, because, and I quote, "there's nothing that makes it geographically unique. And its themes are pretty universal. Good versus evil, loyalty, the family sticking together." The rise of computer animation since the turn of the millennium has accelerated the convergence between live action and animated children's films. According to author David A. Price, to make the new medium feel as familiar as possible, Toy Story's art department sought to stay within the limits of what might be done in a live-action film with real cameras, tripods, dollies, and cranes. They even went as far as to mimic the style of live-action directors with so-called Branagh cam and a Michael Mann cam to describe cinematographic techniques borrowed from Kenneth Branagh's 1994 adaptation of Frankenstein and Michael Mann's iconic 80s cop show, Miami Vice. Computer animated films are full of examples of cameras performing in a fashion that is similar to live action equipment, even though these camera systems in animated films are, of course, virtual. They use cinematographic techniques such as manipulating focus, such as through the use of focus racks. They appropriate stylistic tropes such as motion blur and slow motion. And they even simulate live-action cinematographic errors such as lens flares in films such as Wall-E. This convergence in style between live-action and animation is not by chance. Several computer-animated blockbusters have employed live-action cinematographers such as Roger Deakins, who's an Academy Award-winning cinematographer, to educate animators on how to emulate principles of live-action cinema for aesthetic purposes. DreamWorks' How to Train Your Dragon, which Roger Deakins worked on, is one of the more extreme examples of this practice. The film makes use of extreme close-ups, tracking shots, rapid cutting, and underexposed night scenes. The fluid, high-speed camera movements, the high-octane battle sequences, and the photorealistic motion capture-style animation are all reminiscent of live-action blockbusters that use computer animation for reasons of spectacle, such as the Marvel Cinematic Universe series. Cinematographer Pablo Plastered, who advertised on the cinematography for the Lego Movie, has spoken of his desire for audiences to, and I quote, believe what they were seeing was real, but also to avoid the obvious computer-controlled and floating camera seen in some animated movies. Instead, he wanted to evoke what he called the subconscious language of cinema that people are used to. So this suggests that while computer animation is continuing still to develop its own unique grammar, many filmmakers still desire to anchor computer animation to the familiarizing conventions of live-action cinema. And indeed, Disney downplayed the status of its photorealistic computer-animated remake of The Lion King, released in 2019, as animation. Instead, it described it in publicity materials as a live-action movie, even though the entire movie was created using computer graphics. In this sense, the almost ubiquity of animation in digital Hollywood is working to destabilize traditional boundaries between animated and non-animated films. And I think perhaps the most important lesson that we can take from these examples of live action and animation convergence is the sense that animation has come to be regarded as a style as much as a medium. Just as live action film is becoming increasingly animated, with the ubiquitous use of CGI in blockbuster films, computer animation is continuing to fuse principles of animation, traditional animation, and live-action filmmaking with its own unique aesthetic style. The look of many computer-animated films does have a certain uniform quality, partly due to the fact that most commercial studios use Pixar RenderMan for Maya program to do their digital cinematography. But they also deal in astonishing visual flourishes that were unattainable in the age of two-dimensional animation. So animation scholar Christopher Holliday applies to these films Gilles Deleuze's concept of gaseous perception, where spectators are able to navigate these worlds without real-world constraints like gravity and the weight and limitations of the human body, almost as if we're floating through these fictional worlds. On the other hand, many computer-animated films, as we've seen, continue to ascribe to the conventions of live-action films, retaining much of the style, the tone, and the narrative style of traditional animation. So although Holliday speaks of live-action and animated genres, it actually seems increasingly difficult to separate the two. And as we'll see, many of the key formal principles of post-1990s Hollywood animation can be viewed through the larger prism of creating what executives and also many audiences call relatability, which is essentially the spectator's capacity to fully engage with the films, which seem to rest on the ability to create believable worlds populated with believable inhabitants. So this takes us to the final part of my talk, where I want to talk about the narrative style of contemporary Hollywood animation. Although the formal developments in post-1990s animation might be profound, the storytelling conventions that underpin the form have remained fairly stable since the classical era. Most of Disney's early films were adapted from fairy tales and folk tales or from children's literature, but a lot of contemporary animated films are based on original screenplays. However, at the same time, they still adhere to classical storytelling principles. They adhere to the principle of Hollywood animation being constructed for all-inclusive mixed audiences of adults and children. And the films are also inherently intertextual, so they refer constantly to other films, television shows, and other artifacts of popular culture, partly as a way of appealing to older audiences as well as to children. So to this extent, these films can be located within larger traditions of children's fiction, narrative cinema, including children's film and family film, and also deeper mythological structures, such as folk tales and fairy tales dating back many centuries. If we assume then that genre operates, at least in part, as an unspoken contract between the producer and the audience, then we maybe shouldn't be surprised to see that there's a large degree of consensus between how Disney portrays itself and the meanings critics and audiences attach to the company. So a scholar called Michael Reel in the 1970s did a survey of 200 college students in the United States, and he tried to sample their responses to Disney. And he published this survey in a book, Mass-Mediated Culture, which was published in 1977. And he found that Disney was thought by his students to represent values of happiness, friendliness, honesty, innocence, industriousness, cleanliness, while disapproving of sex, violence, greed, laziness, and un-American activities or leftist politics. So, in other words, all of the students regarded Disney as something that was safe, something that was family-orientated, also something that was traditional, and against new vanguard movements within politics. Now, the Global Disney Audiences Project, which sampled around 1,200 responses to Disney films around the turn of the millennium, had very similar results to Michael Reel's survey in the 1970s. It found that the overwhelming majority of respondents associated Disney with fun and fantasy, magic, good over evil, family, imagination, and love and romance. So seeing the large degree of consensus in how Disney presents itself and how audiences view Disney, we can start to understand that the commercial philosophy of Hollywood animation and of family entertainment more broadly rests on its ability to please as many and to offend as few people as possible. While The Little Mermaid is often remembered as the beginning of the Disney Renaissance, a bold new era for Disney that brought the studio to the attention of a new generation of American youth, it was its adherence to Walt's prescription for the animated classics, good versus evil, overcoming odds to achieve a goal, and a happy ending, the most excited Jeffrey Katzenberg when he read the final screenplay. Many subsequent films, and not just Disney films, have attempted to retain the narrative attractions of this classical formula while updating it with new aesthetic attractions and also more contemporary attitudes towards culture and society. So on the one hand, Disney Renaissance films still foreground the maturation plot, the coming-of-age narrative that was always central to the classic Disney formula. But on the other hand, they also are much more self-consciously modern in their characterization, their settings, their music, their language, and in many cases, their politics as well. So we've talked about the idea of relatability, which is a word that's often used by Hollywood producers and audiences to describe the ability of viewers to engage with a text on a profound emotional level, or maybe even to interpret the character or situation on some level as an avatar of themselves. The term relatable has permeated everyday language in Western popular culture. An internet search reveals hundreds of articles devoted to relatable situations and characters in Hollywood animated features. Many of them fall into the category of clickbait, but there are comparatively serious and developed pieces published by major media outlets such as the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. And notably, Jennifer Lee, who was the co-director of Frozen, suggests that the quality of relatability is essential, and I quote, "if you want to do a film where you have a big scope." These discourses reflect a perception shared by producers and moviegoers alike that mass audiences will only engage with films where they can find a strong resemblance to their own lives. So, a lot of the differences between classical era and contemporary Hollywood animation can be explained by this embrace of the quality of emotional realism. Whereas the musical structures and composers of the early Disney features were associated with high culture, most obviously in Fantasia, in which animation is set to pieces of classical music as conducted by the world-renowned Leopold Stokowski. Post-1990s Disney films feature scores written and performed by world-famous populist musicians such as Elton John and Phil Collins. Equally, the central characters of contemporary films are far removed from the remoteness of classical-era Disney protagonists, whose background, old-fashioned speech patterns, and appearance are all fundamentally strange to most modern audiences. And actually, the perceived weirdness of the classical-era Disney princess is acknowledged and satirized by one of Disney's own films, Ralph Breaks the Internet, when the quirky, nonconformist Princess Vanellope, voiced by Sarah Silverman, meets a group of classical Disney princesses and is shocked by their traumatic personal histories, which include being poisoned, cursed, enslaved, or kidnapped. Whereas most Disney fairy tale characters in the classical era were archetypes, Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, etc., the motivations of their post-1990s counterparts are drawn much more clearly. We can see this in the convention in Disney films since The Little Mermaid to include a Broadway-style I Want musical number in which the protagonist expresses their inner desire, as well as in the commonality of what I call origin stories for the central characters in films like Up and Frozen, and also many other films as well. So even in cases where the film's situation and setting are alien, such as Frozen, which is set in a distant fairy tale kingdom, the main characters of Anna and Elsa talk and act more or less like 21st century American teenagers. These characterizations still accord with the traditional Disney coming-of-age narrative and Joseph Campbell's so-called hero's journey structure, which can be applied to most Hollywood animated features. For this reason, they represent a continuation of much older story tropes that transcend local culture. The familiar and accessible aesthetics, the pleasingly transparent narrative style, and also the relatable idiom of contemporary Hollywood animation are all strategies intended to forge a deep and personal emotional connection between the film and the spectator. So I'd like to conclude just by emphasizing the continuities as well as the changes in classical era and contemporary Hollywood animation. As with the films produced during Walt Disney's lifetime, the dominant impulse in these films is still one of utopianism. Political values and aesthetic trends do vary from film to film and also from generation to generation, but the format remains closely aligned with the perceived interests, beliefs, and aesthetic requirements of the majority. Innovative and significant films continue to be made, of course, but the goal is always the same: mobilizing mass audiences through universalistic or almost universalistic patterns of fantasy, usually as part of a wider franchise machine based on the exploitation of a widely accessible, family-orientated brand. That is at the heart of the Hollywood style of animation, both in the classical era and today. Thank you very much.